The courtroom fell entirely silent as she rose in a striking crimson dress. Across the table, a wealthy man sat paralyzed, realizing his secret fortune now belonged to the wife he tried to discard. How much does ultimate arrogance truly cost? The air inside the Seattle family courtroom felt incredibly heavy, thick, with the scent of polished mahogany and the suffocating weight of impending ruin. Though the morning sun shone brightly outside the tall windows, none of its warmth seemed to reach the side of the room where Clara Hayes sat. At the opposing table, Derek Hayes exuded the relaxed, untouchable confidence of a man who had already won the war. At 38, the CEO of Oriflow wore a sharply tailored navy suit that draped perfectly across his shoulders. He leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a silver pen against his knuckles, surveying the room with a look of absolute triumph. For 10 long years, he and Clara had built the green energy architecture firm from the ground up. But now, with a massive global conglomerate ready to acquire Oriflow for $200 million, Derek was executing his final and most brutal corporate of the deal. Derek's lead attorney, a high-priced litigator known for his ruthless courtroom tactics, stood before the judge's bench. "Your Honor, we are simply asking the court to honor the original shareholder agreement," the attorney said, his voice smooth and commanding. "My client is exercising his legal right to a buyout. We have offered Mrs. Hayes a very generous settlement of $1 million to sever all ties with Oriflow. This will allow the acquisition to move forward unhindered, and it provides her with more than enough capital to start over. $1 million. It was a fraction of a percent of what the company was actually worth. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate erasure of a decade of Clara's life." Across the aisle, 33-year-old Clara sat perfectly still. As the brilliant architectural mind behind every core patent that made Oriflow so valuable, she was the true architect of the company's success. Yet, today, she looked entirely defeated. She was swallowed up by a shapeless heavy gray coat, her shoulders slumped forward, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. To the judge, to the gallery, and most importantly, to Derek, she appeared to be a broken woman, completely crushed by her husband's power and the unforgiving legal system. She kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table, biting her lip, projecting nothing but terrified resignation. Beside her sat Evelyn Vance. At 50, Evelyn was a seasoned family attorney who possessed a rare icy calm. She didn't jump up to object to the opposing counsel's insulting offer. She didn't argue about the blatant injustice of the shareholder agreement. She simply sat there, her hands neatly folded over a yellow legal pad, her sharp eyes tracking every move Derek made. "Messrs. Vance," the judge called out, adjusting his glasses. "Does your client intend to contest the terms of this buyout today?" Evelyn glanced briefly at Clara, who remained silent, staring at the table.
Not,
"Your Honor," Evelyn replied evenly. Derek let out a soft, barely audible scoff. He adjusted his silk tie, his posture relaxing even further. He had broken her.
he had known.
All along that Clara wouldn't have the stomach for a prolonged, vicious legal battle. "Very well," the judge sighed, looking down at the massive stack of paperwork detailing the dissolution of the marriage. "Before I can approve any financial settlement, the court requires the final sworn verification of assets. Mr. Hayes, please stand." Derek stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, elegant motion. The court clerk approached Derek's table, placing a thick document in front of him. It was the financial affidavit, the legally binding declaration of every bank account, every stock option, and every piece of property he claimed to own. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, his voice echoing with absolute authority in the quiet room. "The court takes these disclosures very seriously. Do you swear, under penalty of perjury, that this financial affidavit is a complete, truthful, and accurate representation of all your assets, holdings, and corporate interests?" Derek didn't hesitate. He didn't look away. He placed his hand flat on the stack of papers, his voice projecting clearly across the room. "I do, Your Honor. Every single asset is accounted for. There is nothing else." Underneath her heavy gray coat, Clara's heart settled into a steady, icy rhythm. There is nothing else. She heard the words loud and clear. For months she had endured his condescension. She had watched him parade around, blindly arrogant, confident that his plan to funnel the core patents and the real wealth of their marriage into a shadow corporation in Delaware was untraceable. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. But the moment those words left his mouth, the heavy steel doors of the legal trap slammed shut. He hadn't just lied to her. He had just committed a federal crime right in front of a judge. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," the judge nodded. "Please sign the document." Derek pulled the cap off his silver pen. He leaned over the mahogany table, a smug, victorious smile playing on his lips as he signed his name on the final line, sealing what he believed was his ultimate victory. At the opposing table, Clara finally stopped staring at the wood grain. The facade of the broken, terrified wife vanished in an instant. She slowly looked up, her eyes flashing with a cold, absolute sharpness as she turned her head toward Evelyn Vance and gave a very slight, deliberate nod. Evelyn Vance caught the subtle, almost imperceptible nod from her client. It was the exact signal they had waited 2 long, agonizing years to execute. Up at the high mahogany bench, the judge adjusted his reading glasses and reached for his wooden gavel, fully prepared to finalize the dissolution of the marriage and cement Derek's insultingly low $1 million buyout. "Your Honor." Evelyn's voice rang out, cutting through the heavy, stagnant air of the courtroom like a sharpened blade. She stood up smoothly from the plaintiff's table. "The respondent strongly objects to the court accepting that financial affidavit." Derek's lead attorney was on his feet in a heartbeat, his face flushing with sudden aggressive irritation. "Objection! What is this?" "Your Honor. Opposing counsel cannot ambush this court at the 11th hour, simply because her client is suddenly unhappy with the settlement." Clara did not flinch at the lawyer's condescending tone. Wrapped in her shapeless, heavy gray coat, she sat perfectly still, her breathing steady. She kept her eyes locked on Derek. He was still standing by his table, holding his expensive silver pen, a patronizing smirk on his face. He clearly viewed Evelyn's interruption as the pathetic, desperate thrashing of a losing team. "This is not an ambush," Evelyn replied, her tone icy and deeply authoritative. She reached down into her briefcases and pulled out a thick manila folder, a physical weight she had deliberately kept hidden from view until this exact second. "This is a matter of direct, documented fraud pertaining to the statement Mr. Hayes just signed. Under the rules of civil procedure, evidence of fraud upon the court can be introduced at any time." The phrase, "fraud upon the court," seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. The judge's hand froze mid-air, hovering just inches above his sound block. The bored, administrative demeanor he had carried all morning instantly vanished, replaced by a hardened, dangerous glare. "Approach the bench," the judge commanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Both of you now." Evelyn stepped confidently into the center aisle. Derek's lawyer matched her pace, muttering under his breath about frivolous delay tactics and sanctions. At the defense table, Derek's smug smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly forced it back into place. He had nothing to hide, he told himself. His real wealth was secure, buried so deep in an untraceable corporate network that a local family attorney could never possibly find it. Evelyn placed the heavy stack of documents directly in front of the judge. "Your Honor, late last night, my office received certified corporate registry files from the state of Delaware. They contain a detailed ledger of intellectual property transfers originating directly from Oriflow." Derek's posture went rigidly stiff. "Delaware?" A cold, sharp prickle of unease started at the base of his neck. Why was she talking about Delaware? "These documents," Evelyn continued, making sure her voice projected clearly across the room so every single syllable reached Derek's ears, "prove that Mr. Hayes has spent the last 18 months systematically transferring the core green energy patents of Oriflow into a private shell company. A company he deliberately failed to disclose on the affidavit he just swore was entirely truthful." Derek's lawyer hissed, though the confident bluster had suddenly drained from his voice. He shot nervous, sideways glance toward his client. He had not been briefed on any offshore or out-of-state shell companies. "My client is a highly respected CEO. We cannot verify the authenticity of some random corporate filings brought in to disrupt a finalized settlement. They bear the official, raised seal of the Delaware Division of Corporations," the judge interrupted. his eyes rapidly scanning the first page of the ledger. The color slowly drained from his stern face. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Derek with the intensity of a predator. "Counselor, are you or your client aware of a corporate entity designed to hold these missing assets?" Derek's lawyer turned around, silently begging his client for a lifeline, an explanation, anything to stop the bleeding, but Derek was completely paralyzed. His bespoke suit suddenly felt entirely too tight, suffocating him. He stared across the room at Clara, expecting to see the broken, terrified woman he had easily manipulated for a decade. Instead, Clara was sitting perfectly upright. The facade of the weeping, helpless wife was gone. In its place was a look of cold, calculating intelligence. It was the piercing stare of a grandmaster watching her opponent step willingly into a fatal trap. She had known. The horrific realization hit Derek like a physical blow to the chest. She had known everything, and she had sat there in silence, letting him dig his own grave. Evelyn stepped back from the bench, allowing the heavy tension to stretch just long enough for the panic to fully set into the defense table. She pulled one final sheet of paper from her folder, letting it hit the wooden surface with a sharp, definitive smack. "The shell company in question, Your Honor," Evelyn announced. Echoing off the ceiling is registered under the name Apexion. The heavy silver pen slipped from Derek's trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a hollow clatter that echoed through the dead, breathless silence of the room. The metallic clatter of the dropped pen seemed to echo against the wood-paneled walls for an eternity. For a long, suffocating moment, nobody in the Seattle courtroom moved. The stifling midday heat pressing against the tall windows suddenly felt 10 times heavier inside. Derek stared blankly at the floor, where his expensive pen had rolled to a stop, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He swallowed hard, trying to force moisture back into his desperately dry throat. He snapped his head toward his defense attorney, his eyes wide and silently pleading. "Fix this," his panicked expression screamed. His lawyer leaned in close, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper. "What is she talking about? What is this shell company?" "I don't know," Derek hissed back, lying purely on reflex. He scrambled to compose himself, his mind racing for an exit. He stood up a little straighter, gripping the edge of the mahogany table to hide the tremor in his hands. "Your Honor, this is a complete fabrication. This entity. My wife is clearly attempting a desperate, last-minute smear campaign to delay the proceedings." Clara remained perfectly still in her seat, the kept Greek coat still draped over her shoulders. She didn't flinch at his blatant lie, nor did she show a hint of anger. Instead, a deep, quiet satisfaction settled into her chest. Watched him flail, enjoying the undeniable thrill of watching a deeply arrogant man walk blindly into a trap he could not charm his way out of. "I anticipated Mr. Hayes might suffer a sudden lapse in memory," Evelyn said. Her voice was smooth, unbothered, and utterly dominant. She reached back into her leather briefcase and pulled out a second, much thicker stack of paper. "Which is why we have also submitted Exhibit B for the court's immediate review." She handed the thick bundle to the bailiff, who carried it up to the high bench. The sharp rustling of the paper sounded like a crackling fire in the dead silent room. "What you are looking at, Your Honor, is a verified transcript of encrypted digital communications," Villa explained, pacing slowly back toward Clara. "These are messages exchanged over a hidden network, commonly referred to as the dark web, between a user, traced directly to the respondent's personal IP address, and an anonymous digital broker." Derek's breath hitched, the walls of the courtroom began to spin. The dark web. How could she possibly have that? He had been so careful. He had used specialized browsers, paid the broker in untraceable digital currency, and communicated only with ghosts. In these printed emails, Evelyn continued, her voice rising with unmistakable authority, Mr. Hayes explicitly lays out a step-by-step directive to establish the Delaware Shell Company, Apexion. Furthermore, he gives direct, undeniable orders to the anonymous broker to systematically transfer the core green energy patents out of Oriflow and into Poost and into this hidden entity. He orchestrated a massive scheme to drain the marital estate of its true value just months before filing for this divorce. Clara allowed herself a slow, measured breath. Evelyn was performing the legal execution flawlessly, But the true architect of this specific moment was the man who hadn't even set foot in the courtroom. Marcus Thorne, the corporate intelligence expert she had secretly hired, had done exactly what she paid him to do. He had intercepted the digital breadcrumbs, mapping out the very network Derek thought was his impenetrable shield. Up at the bench, the judge flipped through the print. His face, usually a mask of strict judicial neutrality, darkened into an expression of sheer outrage. He was reading the unvarnished arrogance of a man conspiring to cheat the legal system, spelled out in black and white. "This is a gross violation of my client's," Derek's lawyer practically shouted, slamming his hand on the table. But the aggressive bluster had drained from his voice. He sounded erratic and unsure. "You cannot introduce illegally obtained digital surveillance. It was obtained legally through a licensed corporate investigator. After Mrs. Hayes noticed severe, unexplained discrepancies in the firm's shared accounting, Evelyn fired back, effortlessly, not missing a beat, and privacy laws do not protect the active commission of financial fraud, counselor. Enough." The single word. He glared down at the defense table, holding up a page of the decrypted transcripts.
"Mr. Hayes, this document outlines
An intentional, calculated scheme to hide hundreds of millions of dollars from this court. It is accompanied by digital receipts and routing numbers that perfectly match the missing intellectual property from your firm." Derek gripped the table so hard, his knuckles turned stark white. His polished, aristocratic facade had completely shattered. He was trapped, cornered by his own intricate web of deceit, with absolutely nowhere to run. His chest heaving, he looked frantically to his right, desperately waiting for his highly paid legal shark to deploy some brilliant countermeasure to save him. The judge leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. "I want an explanation for these encrypted communications immediately. And it had better be good." Derek turned to his right, but his seasoned lawyer didn't say a word in his defense. Instead, the attorney slowly and deliberately took a step back, physically distancing himself from his own client. The high-priced attorney's sudden retreat left Derek completely exposed at the defense table. In the brutal world of corporate law, the line between aggressive advocacy and becoming an accessory to a federal crime was absolute, and Derek's legal team had just abandoned him to save themselves. The judge didn't even look at the retreating lawyer. His furious gaze remained locked entirely on Derek, whose breathing had become shallow and erratic. "Your Honor," Evelyn Vance's voice cut through the stagnant air, crisp and unbothered. She stepped closer to the bench, tapping the official Delaware corporate registry documents. "The fraud is complete. Mr. Hayes has openly sworn under oath that he has no other assets, right before this court was handed the certified proof of his hidden empire. But there is one final piece of evidence within this ledger that concludes our submission." The judge leaned over the bench, his eyes scanning the images of the Manila folder. "The ownership structure of this Apexian entity is masked by a blind trust, Ms. Vance. Who is listed as the ultimate legal beneficiary?" Derek felt a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. He forced himself to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His pristine corporate facade was entirely gone, replaced by the raw, wild panic of a cornered animal. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger across the aisle. "She did this. She hacked my accounts. She tampered with my files. Your Honor, you cannot allow this illegal circus to destroy my life's work." "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." "Pardon me, Mr. Hayes," the judge roared, slamming his gavel down with a sound like a gunshot. "One more outburst from you, and the bailiff will remove you to a holding cell for contempt. You will remain silent." Derek sank back into his chair, panting heavily, his vision blurring at the edges. He looked around the room, but he was entirely alone. His lawyer was staring at the ceiling, his associates were looking away, and the gallery behind him had gone dead quiet. It was in this moment of absolute isolation that Clara stood up. With a slow, deliberate motion, she unbuttoned the shapeless, heavy gray coat she had worn like a shield throughout the entire 6 months of mediation. She slid the drab fabric off her shoulders and let it pool carelessly onto her empty chair. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Beneath the dull gray disguise, Clara stood rook row and magnificent in a brilliant off-the-shoulder crimson dress. The vibrant red fabric clung elegantly to her frame, completely transforming her presence from a defeated victim into a figure of absolute power and command. Standing tall and unyielding on the right side of the courtroom, she commanded the entire space. Derek stared at his wife, his jaw dropping open in sheer, suffocating horror. His high-priced lead attorney Sunging So, instantly bolting upright from his seat as he realized the magnitude of the visual shift. Behind them, Derek's remaining corporate cronies and assistants in the rows looked on, their faces twisted in absolute shock at the stunning lote sack of the woman they had spent days belittling. Clara didn't look at the crowd. She kept her cold, absolute sniper precision, focused entirely on the trembling man across the aisle. She had let him build his arrogant, bulletproof defense. She had let him parade his lies on the permanent record, waiting for the exact second he committed himself fully to his own destruction. Evelyn Vance turned smoothly toward her client, gesturing toward the podium. My client wishes to read the final designation clause into the record herself, Your Honor. The judge, completely captivated by the dramatic shift in the room's energy, offered a curt, respectful nod. Granted. Clara stepped up to the microphone. Her posture was straight, her hands resting calmly on the polished wood. When she spoke, her voice was no longer a whisper. It was steady, cool, and devastatingly calm. Clara hiên ngang đứng thẳng trong chiếc váy đỏ rực, chậm rãi, đọc từ cái tên duy nhất nằm trong một người thụ hưởng hợp pháp, khiến Derek khuỵu hẳn xuống bàn. The absolute certainty of his ruin hung over the defense table like a suffocating shroud. Derek remained slumped in his leather chair, his forehead nearly resting on the polished mahogany. He didn't speak. He didn't even try to move. The brilliant, untouchable CEO who had walked into the room that morning had been entirely dismantled. Reduced to a hollow, terrified shell by a single signature on a Delaware corporate filing. From the plaintiff's table, Clara watched him. She didn't gloat, nor did she raise her voice to demand an apology. Standing tall in her vibrant crimson dress, she simply absorbed the profound silence of the courtroom, letting the reality of her total victory settle into her bones. Up at the bench, the judge took off his reading glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. When he looked back down at the defense table, his expression was a portrait of cold, judicial fury. Mr. Hayes, the judge's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. In my decades on the bench, I have seen spouses try to hide assets. But I have rarely witnessed such a calculated, arrogant, and meticulously planned attempt to pervert the justice system and defraud a partner. Derek slowly lifted his head, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer some kind of excuse to save his life's work, but no words came out. You sat in my courtroom, the judge continued, pointing a stern finger down at him, and swore under penalty of perjury that your financial disclosures were complete. You attempted to use this court as a weapon to force your wife into accepting a pitiful $1 million settlement, all while you secretly funneled the true value of your shared enterprise into a shadow corporation. The judge picked up his pen, sharply pulling the final dissolution decree toward him. Because you so brilliantly engineered the transfer of Oriflow's core intellectual property into Apexion, the judge declared, writing furiously, I am officially voiding the previous shareholder agreement. I rule that the Apexion entity and the $200 million it represents is the sole, separate and legal property of its rightful beneficiary. Clara Hayes, beside Evelyn Vance, allowed herself a small, rare smile, quietly packing her yellow legal pad into her briefcase. The legal slaughter was complete. Furthermore, the judge added, his voice hardening even further, I am ordering the bailiff to impound every document submitted today. A complete copy of these dark web transcripts, the Delaware Registry, and your sworn affidavit will be forwarded directly to the United States Attorney's Office. I strongly suggest you spend your remaining time finding a very good federal criminal defense attorney, Mr. Hayes, because you are going to need one. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. It hovered in the air for a fraction of a second, carrying the full weight of the law. The end of a toxic marriage and the ultimate doom of a deceitful man. Bang! The sharp crack of the wad echoed through the room like a definitive period at the end of a 10-year sentence. This court is adjourned. As the gallery began to murmur, and the bailiff moved in to collect the files, Clara looked down at her ex-husband one last time. A sudden, heavy wave of memory washed over her. The ghost of her 10 years of youth, the late nights sketching green energy blueprints while he pitched to investors, the blind trust she had once placed in the man sitting across from her. It was a bitter, painful reminder of a decade she could never get back. But as she looked at Derek now, paralyzed, abandoned by his own lawyers, and facing years in a federal prison, the bitterness simply evaporated. She felt no lingering rage. She didn't even feel the urge to hurl a frontal insult at him. She just felt a profound, overwhelming lightness. The burden of his manipulation was finally gone. Clara offered Evelyn a warm, deeply grateful smile and shook the older woman's hand. Then, she reached down and picked up her heavy gray coat from the chair. She didn't put it back on. She didn't need to hide anymore. Draping it over her arm, Clara turned and walked down the center aisle, her heels clicking steadily against the hardwood floor. She never looked back. She pushed open the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the wide stone steps. The late afternoon Seattle sun broke through the clouds, washing over her in a warm golden light. The crisp breeze caught her hair, carrying the scent of rain and the undeniable promise of a new beginning. Clara took a deep, unrestrained breath, her heart soaring. She had reclaimed her empire, but more importantly, she had reclaimed herself, ready to build a magnificent future entirely on her own terms.